I never imagined I would feel the kind of shock and heartbreak that comes from being betrayed by your own blood. And yet here I am, sitting in my quiet living room with the late afternoon sun streaming through the curtains, thinking over and over about how my brother could turn his back on me so completely. My name is John Harrison. I am 52 years old, and this is the story of a betrayal so profound it still twists my stomach every time I replay it in my mind. It all began with the death of our father, a man who was as tough as old oak but fair, a man who spent decades working his hands to the bone to give me and my brother a life full of opportunities, comfort, and security, a life that he imagined we would share with love, respect, and honor. Growing up, I had always thought of family as the one place where trust was guaranteed, where loyalty was unspoken, and protection was instinctive. I believed in the kind of bond that no money or petty greed could ever break. But I learned the hard way that some people, even those you grow up with, wear their smiles like masks, hiding motives so dark that when they are finally revealed they feel like a punch in the gut, so sharp it steals your breath. I remember the day of the will reading with perfect clarity, as if it were etched into my mind like a photograph I could never shake. The lawyer called, a formal note that seemed ordinary at first, but my gut told me something about that day would linger forever. I walked into the office, thinking it would be emotional but straightforward, a matter of understanding how our father had chosen to divide what he had spent his life building. I expected tears and maybe a few whispered words between my brother and me, perhaps a quiet sense of reflection on the man we had just lost. What I was not prepared for, what I could not have foreseen even in my darkest imaginings, was the smile on my brother's face as he stood there, smug and self-satisfied, and announced that he had already transferred my share of the inheritance to himself through some obscure legal maneuver I had never heard of and could barely even comprehend. The room felt like it had tilted on its axis, the air thick and heavy around me, and my hands shook in a way that made it impossible to hold onto the chair I was sitting in. My heart raced, my mind scrambled, and for a long moment all I could do was stare at him in disbelief, trying to understand how someone I had shared a childhood, a home, a father with could betray me so fully. How could he do this? How could my own brother steal from me the inheritance that our father had intended to be a symbol of fairness, of love, of shared history? And as the initial shock began to settle, a creeping awareness sank in that nothing about life would ever be the same again. I realized then, with a clarity that was almost painful, that I could not simply sit back and accept this. I could not allow him to walk away with everything while I stayed silent, shrinking into bitterness. At the same time, I understood that any rash action would be foolish. I had to plan, to wait, to observe, to learn before I made my move. My father's memory deserved more than that, and I owed myself the chance to reclaim what was rightfully mine, not through anger or brute force, but through careful strategy and patience. From that moment, the days that followed were colored by a mixture of grief, rage, and a slow-burning determination. A sense that the life I had known was over, but a new one where I could regain my dignity and sense of justice, was waiting, hidden just beyond the horizon, if I had the wisdom to seize it. The weeks that followed my brother's betrayal were some of the darkest and most confusing of my life, days that felt stretched and hollow, filled with an emptiness that gnawed at me from the inside out. I tried to go about my routine, telling myself I had to carry on, but every small task felt heavy with the weight of what had been stolen from me, not just the inheritance but the trust, the bond, the sense of family that I had believed was unbreakable. My brother lived in a city several hours away, in the grand mansion he had always fantasized about as a boy. A house so meticulously designed and so ostentatiously displayed that every detail seemed to mock me, a constant reminder of his triumph at my expense. He drove the sleek cars he had always admired, wore the tailored suits he once envied in magazines, and strutted through life as though every success he claimed was earned and deserved, when in reality it was built on deceit, cunning, and betrayal. Meanwhile, I was left with nothing but the fattening echoes of childhood memories, a lingering anger that pulsed in my veins like a slow drumbeat, and the bitter taste of injustice that clung to every thought. For years I had worked honestly, lived simply, and done my best to honor the values my father had instilled in me. Yet all of that seemed irrelevant now, meaningless in the shadow of my brother's greed. During those long, restless days, I forced myself to do what I rarely did in life: observe, analyze, and plan, transforming my grief and anger into quiet, simmering focus. I began watching him from a distance, learning his routines, noting the way he moved through his days with careless confidence, listening to the way he laughed too loudly in conversations, studying the habits that made him feel untouchable. It was strange, almost surreal, how every little detail about him, the way he checked his watch, the friends he surrounded himself with, the small gestures of vanity, revealed cracks in his armor that he himself seemed blind to. The more I observed, the clearer it became that his arrogance, that blinding pride, was not a strength but a vulnerability, a weakness he wore like a crown that made him feel invincible, when in truth it was a sign of how fragile he really was. Every time he boasted about his acquisitions, flaunted his success, or dismissed others with a wave of his hand, I felt a quiet satisfaction building inside me, a sense that the universe had a balance waiting to be restored, that this same arrogance which shielded him from conscience might one day lead him to his own undoing. And so, day by day, I turned my pain into patience, my anger into observation, and my loss into a slow, deliberate strategy, knowing that understanding him completely was the first step toward reclaiming what had been stolen and restoring the sense of justice that life, or at least I, deserved. Those first few nights after learning what my brother had done were some of the longest nights of my life, and no matter how tired I felt, my mind would not let me sleep in peace. I would lie in my bed staring at the ceiling while anger and sadness twisted inside me like a storm that refused to settle, and every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing his face, that smug expression, that careless attitude, that confidence built on lies and betrayal. I kept asking myself the same painful question again and again. Why would he do this to me? Why would he betray his own family, his own brother, who had stood by him through childhood fights, through hard times, through moments when nobody else believed in him? The questions circled endlessly, but each answer led only to more confusion and more pain, until I realized that letting anger control me would only destroy me from the inside. I knew I had to be smarter than that. I had to calm myself and think clearly, because anger alone would not bring back what was mine. So I turned my attention inward, forcing myself to breathe slowly and focus on what I could do rather than what had already happened. I began with the smallest steps possible, because I knew I needed knowledge more than anything else. I started learning about property rules, inheritance rules, and the kind of financial tricks people use to manipulate wealth. I spent hours reading through documents that were so dull I could barely stay awake, yet I pushed myself through every line, because I knew the understanding I gained might help me reclaim the life that had been taken from me. I met with lawyers quietly without telling anyone what I was doing, and asked question after question, hoping to find even a thin thread I could pull that might unravel the scheme my brother had used against me. Each meeting taught me something new, something that built my confidence piece by piece. At that stage, it was not revenge, it was preparation, and it was the slow rebuilding of my sense of power and control. But the hardest part, the part that wore me down more than all the reading and research, was pretending everything was fine whenever my brother called or sent a message. He acted like nothing had happened, as if he had done nothing wrong, and I had to force myself to speak gently, to speak calmly, to smile through the phone, even though every word tasted bitter in my mouth. I answered his calls with a steady voice, while inside me, a very different voice whispered plans, strategies, and intentions he would never suspect. I acted like his loyal brother while quietly planning how to reclaim my rightful share, and maybe give him a taste of the humility he had never known. I trained myself to be patient, to hide my true feelings, until the right time came, because I knew rushing into action would only give him more power. So I held my silence, endured the ache in my chest, and let him believe he had won, while deep down I crafted a plan that would show him he had underestimated me completely. Those silent nights and those calm conversations were my battleground long before any real move was made. And in those moments, I learned that strength is not always loud. Strength is sometimes the quiet, steady flame that refuses to die even in the darkest hours. It was weeks later when I truly began to understand the full depth of what my brother had done, and the realization hit me like a slow, crushing wave that stole my breath and left me trembling in quiet disbelief. I had known he had taken my inheritance, and I had known it was unfair, but seeing the extent of his greed laid bare before me, something entirely different, something that felt personal and malicious in a way that pierced far deeper than money ever could. He had not only taken the assets my father had worked a lifetime to leave me, he had also begun the subtle and insidious work of erasing me from our father's life story, as if I had never existed as a part of the family that had been ours from birth. Family photos I had remembered as milestones were gone or rearranged, and in their place were images where he stood at the center proudly smiling, as if the achievements of our father had always belonged solely to him. He told friends and distant relatives stories that painted me as greedy, as selfish, as someone unworthy of the legacy our father had built, and every whispered word he spread felt like a dagger to the heart that I could not remove. With every conversation he twisted, every memory he rewrote history, and I realized in a moment of cold clarity that I was not only robbed of money, but also stripped of dignity, stripped of the recognition of the life we had shared, of the love and trust that had existed between a father and his sons. It was in that darkness that an idea first began to form in my mind, an idea that grew slowly and carefully like a fire hidden beneath the embers of rage and hurt. What if I could turn the tables? What if I could take something he loved more than anything else and make it mine in a way he could never ignore, in a way that would show him that greed and betrayal are never without consequence? I knew instantly that it would not be simple or rash. It would require patience, intelligence, and a long, careful plan that could not be rushed. I had to wait for the perfect moment to act, a moment when he would feel untouchable, a moment when his arrogance blinded him completely, and only then would the scales tip in a way that could not be ignored. I began to imagine scenarios quietly in my mind, watching him in my imagination, as he lived in the life he thought he had won, as I plotted every detail with care, calculating timing and opportunity, and considering the consequences of each move. In that moment, I felt a strange mixture of anger and clarity, anger at what he had done and clarity at what could be done to restore the balance that life seemed to have so cruelly disrupted. The seed of revenge was planted not out of hate, but out of a need for justice, a need to reclaim what had been stolen, and to remind him that no one can take everything from someone else without eventually facing the consequences. And so, I waited quietly, observing and learning, building my strategy with patience and care, knowing that the right moment would come. And when it did, it would change everything in a way he could never foresee and never escape. For months, I moved quietly in the shadows of my own life, carefully turning over every detail of my brother's world in my mind, and thinking about the best way to reclaim what had been stolen from me without letting anyone, especially him, suspect what I was planning. Every day I devoted hours to research, not the kind of research that makes headlines or shows, but the slow, meticulous kind that tests patience and sharpens focus. I pored over property listings of the city where he lived, learning the neighborhoods, the streets, the houses, the ones he always admired and fantasized about, but could never openly admit he wanted. And then one day, after endless searches and quiet nights filled with maps and notes and late calls to anonymous agents, I stumbled across a listing that made my heart pound like a drum in my chest. It was his dream house, the one he had spoken about for years, with the kind of longing that made anyone who heard him smile knowingly, thinking it was out of reach forever. And yet here, it was in plain view, available through a third party. The irony of it was almost poetic, the universe almost laughing in my face, as if to say patience has its reward and opportunity, has a way of presenting itself to those who are willing to wait and observe. That house that had been the symbol of his desire, his pride, his sense of achievement, was now mine to plan for and claim if I played my cards carefully. From that moment, every thought I had was consumed with planning and calculation. I met with real estate agents, lawyers, and financial advisors, all in secret, quietly building the framework that would allow me to strike at the right moment. Every number, every clause, every possible reaction he might have was catalogued and studied, as I imagined how he would behave when the reality finally struck him. I calculated the purchase price, the timing, the way the deal would look on paper, the way it would feel when he realized what had happened, and the subtle power of watching him understand that the life he flaunted and believed untouchable could be taken away without a single illegal act. It was strange because every step of the plan was completely legal, but the satisfaction it promised had the sharp tang of poetic justice. I felt a strange thrill knowing that I was not breaking the law, that I was not acting out of malice, but rather carefully using the rules of life and property and patience to expose him in a way he could never see coming. Every late-night call, every quiet meeting, every calculated move built a sense of control inside me that I had not felt in months. And I knew that, when the moment came, it would be more than a victory. It would be a statement, a lesson that arrogance and greed always carry consequences if someone waits long enough to see them. And so I prepared endlessly, quietly, carefully, waiting for the precise moment when all the planning, the observation, and the patience would finally converge to give me the opportunity to reclaim not just my inheritance, but the satisfaction of proving to him that betrayal has its limits and justice, even delayed, has a way of finding its mark. The day I had been waiting for with equal parts anticipation and nerves finally arrived, and I remember waking up that morning with a strange mixture of calm and adrenaline coursing through me, as if my body somehow knew this was the moment where patience and careful planning would finally meet action. I double-checked the documents, the numbers, the accounts, everything to ensure there was no mistake, no unexpected obstacle that could ruin what I had worked so long and quietly to achieve. And then I made the offer on the house my brother had dreamed about for years, the house he had built up in his mind, as a symbol of success, power, and accomplishment. Within days, the offer was accepted, and the deal was closed, and suddenly, in a way that felt almost surreal, the house that he had long fantasized about and flaunted to anyone who would listen was officially mine. I remember standing outside that house for the first time, imagining the shock on his face, imagining the realization dawning slowly, and then perhaps all at once, and I had to pinch myself to make sure I was awake, because the reality was almost too strange to believe. When he found out, he laughed at first, thinking it was some kind of cruel joke, a prank that would be explained in a few moments, and I could see the spark of triumph in his eyes, thinking he had the upper hand. But then that spark was replaced by confusion, and finally, a wide-eyed shock that he could not hide no matter how hard he tried. I calmly showed him the paperwork, letting him read every word, letting him process the fact that the house he had long considered untouchable was no longer in his grasp, and I could feel the weight of that moment settle in both of us. This was no longer about money or property. It was about proving a point, about consequences, about the reality that life often finds ways to balance itself, even in situations where greed and arrogance make one believe they are untouchable. I did not gloat, I did not shout, I did not celebrate in a way that would diminish the moment or make me seem cruel. I simply handed him the truth on a silver platter and walked away, leaving him to wrestle with the reality that he had lost more than just wealth, that he had lost the illusion of control that had given him such pride for so many years. In that instant, I realized that satisfaction does not always come from words or anger or revenge. It comes from knowing you have acted with intelligence, patience, and integrity, and that the universe has a way of showing the truth to those who think they are above it. Every step I had taken, every careful observation, every secret meeting, every calculation had led to this singular moment where life itself had delivered the lesson in a way he could not ignore. And I could finally feel a strange calm wash over me, the kind of calm that comes from knowing justice, even in its quietest form, is often sweeter than any moment of triumph imagined in anger. A few weeks after I had closed the deal on the house and allowed the reality of my actions to settle, fate presented the moment I had been waiting for in the most unexpected and ironic way at a family gathering that I had not intended to attend but could not avoid. The room was filled with familiar faces, people I had known all my life, and yet the atmosphere felt charged in a way I could not explain, as if the air itself carried the tension I had been carefully cultivating in my mind. He was there wearing the same confident smile I had once admired in him as a younger man, but now it seemed forced and brittle, the kind of smile someone wears when they know they are on the edge of something unfamiliar and threatening. As soon as our eyes met, I could sense the shift. His posture tightened, and his voice carried an edge he could not hide even when he tried to mask it with casual conversation. He asked me quietly but pointedly how I had managed to afford the house, how I had accomplished what he thought impossible, and I simply smiled back at him, a slow, measured smile that spoke volumes without a single word leaving my lips. I told him it was about timing and patience, and that was all I said because nothing more needed to be explained. The look that passed over his face told me everything I needed to know. The surprise, the frustration, the dawning understanding that he had underestimated me completely, and that the life he had believed untouchable was now beyond his control. In that fleeting moment, standing among family and friends, I understood something I had not truly realized before about revenge, about the delicate art of justice, not delivered in rage or malice, but in subtlety and calculated truth. Revenge is not always about destruction. It is about creating an awakening in the other person, making them feel the weight of their actions without a single shout or accusation, allowing them to confront their own choices and recognize the consequences that come from arrogance and betrayal. I had achieved what I had set out to do, and the satisfaction that coursed through me was not bitter or vengeful. It was calm, steady, and quietly triumphant. A sense of balance restored in a way that required no harsh words or spectacle. There was immense power in subtlety, in patience, in letting actions speak louder than anger and letting life itself deliver the lesson in its own time. Watching him process the reality of his loss, I felt a quiet sense of closure, a serenity that comes from knowing that justice had been served not through force, but through intelligence, timing, and the kind of clever patience that turns a moment of reckoning into something unforgettable. A lesson in humility that he would carry with him whether he admitted it or not. And standing there in that room among the people we both knew, I realized that the true victory was not the house or the inheritance. It was the quiet triumph of proving that patience, wisdom, and dignity could accomplish what anger and confrontation never could, leaving him to grapple with the truth in silence, while I felt a sense of peace that I had never imagined possible. After that moment at the family gathering, after seeing the shock and dawning realization in my brother's eyes, I felt a shift within myself, as if a weight I had carried for months had finally been lifted. And for the first time in a long time, I stopped thinking about revenge, stopped letting anger and hurt dictate the rhythm of my days and nights, and instead began to focus on living my own life in a way that felt meaningful and fulfilling. I poured myself into rebuilding what had been lost, not in the material sense, but in the sense of purpose and joy, reconnecting with the world in ways I had neglected while consumed by the pain of betrayal. I traveled to places I had always dreamed of visiting, walking through cities and landscapes that reminded me there was more to life than grudges and bitterness, letting the vastness of the world calm the turbulence in my chest. I invested in small businesses and projects that mattered to me, not for profit or power, but for the sense of accomplishment and creation, feeling the satisfaction that comes from building something of your own hands and heart. I reconnected with old friends, with people whose company had been a balm to my soul in younger years, savoring laughter and memories and conversation that reminded me of the warmth I had once taken for granted. And most importantly, I forgave myself for allowing someone else to hurt me so deeply, for allowing myself to be caught in a trap of betrayal and anger, instead of trusting my instincts and preparing for the right moment to act. That forgiveness was heavier and more powerful than anything else. It lifted me in ways I had not imagined possible and allowed me to breathe fully again. As the months passed, my brother eventually left the city, moving far away into a life stripped of the illusion of invincibility and pride he had once carried so easily. He looked humiliated and alone. Though I never wished him harm, I understood that his departure was a reflection of the lessons he needed to learn about greed and betrayal, and the consequences of living without conscience. Life has a strange way of teaching lessons to those willing to wait and watch, and to those who are patient enough to act with wisdom rather than rashness. And I realized that this experience had given me a rare insight into human nature and the fragile balance between justice and morality. I had restored my own life not through malice but through careful action and integrity, proving to myself that it is possible to reclaim dignity without compromising who you are, and that true power lies in patience, in understanding, and the ability to rise above bitterness, while still asserting the value of your own worth. In the quiet moments, I would sometimes think back to the journey from betrayal to triumph and feel a calm satisfaction in knowing that I had navigated it with intelligence and grace, and that the lessons I had learned about family, trust, and resilience would guide me for the rest of my life in ways no amount of money or lost inheritance could ever teach. Looking back now, years after the events that reshaped my life, I realize more clearly than ever how profoundly the experience changed me, how it stripped away illusions and forced me to see the world and the people I loved in a starkly honest light, and how it shaped the person I have become today, someone who understands the fragility of trust and the weight of true patience. I learned painfully and unforgettably that family, the people you think will always have your back, can disappoint you in ways that cut deeper than any stranger ever could, that the faces we trust most can hide intentions we would never suspect behind smiles that once seemed comforting and familiar, and that sometimes the people we call our own can become the architects of our deepest wounds, leaving us to confront a reality we never imagined we would face. Yet alongside this realization came the understanding that while anger is immediate and raw and satisfying in fleeting moments, it is patience, intelligence, and dignity that create change that lasts and achieves results that rage alone could never bring. Through careful thought, observation, and quiet determination, I have been able to reclaim not just material things, but also my sense of self, my pride, and the calm assurance that I had acted rightly without surrendering to the very impulses that could have corrupted me and turned me into the person I despised. I hope that anyone listening to this story can understand that revenge is rarely about hatred or the desire to hurt another. It is about reclaiming control over your life, asserting your own worth, and restoring balance in a way that does not compromise your integrity. The most powerful form of retribution is often silent, calculated, and delivered through wisdom and strategy rather than through emotion or confrontation. And sometimes it is simply about being smarter, calmer, and more resilient than the person who sought to destroy you. There is a quiet strength in enduring pain, observing carefully, and waiting for the right moment to act with clarity and precision, a strength that teaches far more than any outward display of anger ever could. Looking back on what happened, I see now that every moment of hurt, every sleepless night, and every pang of betrayal served a purpose, shaping my mind and heart into something stronger and more patient and more aware of human nature than I had ever been before. I realized that life does not always give justice immediately, and it rarely hands out lessons the way we hope. But for those who are patient and perceptive, who are willing to endure and think strategically, The universe has a way of restoring balance in ways we could not imagine and delivering a sense of quiet but undeniable satisfaction that comes not from vengeance, but from the assurance that we have acted with intelligence and moral clarity, and that we have reclaimed what is rightfully ours without losing ourselves along the way. In the end, what I gained from my inheritance was far more than money or property. It was a profound lesson in justice, patience, and the quiet power of restraint, a lesson that shaped not only how I saw the world but also how I saw myself. I came to understand that life is a constant test, filled with moments that push us to our limits, moments where people we trust may betray us in ways so unexpected and painful that they shake the very foundation of our belief in fairness and love. And yet, I also realize that it is never the betrayal itself that defines us, but rather our response to it, the choices we make when the world seems to have turned against us, and the paths we take when the instinct to lash out or sink into despair threatens to overwhelm reason and morality. I chose a path that allowed me to reclaim what was mine while preserving my own dignity, a path that proved my strength not through anger or vengeance, but through intelligence, patience, and careful planning, a path that allowed me to demonstrate the consequences of greed and betrayal without ever crossing the line into cruelty or malice. It is a strange kind of power, one that does not roar or strike, but moves quietly, steadily, with a precision that leaves no doubt in the mind of those who thought themselves untouchable. And it is far more satisfying than any moment of impulsive retaliation could ever be. If you are listening to this story, I want you to understand that even when betrayal cuts so deep it feels like it will leave a permanent scar, there is always a way to rise above it, to restore what was taken and reclaim your sense of self, without becoming the kind of person who would hurt another in return. The world has an uncanny sense of balance, and though it may seem slow or even cruel at times, it has a way of rewarding those who endure patiently and act with wisdom and cleverness, rather than fury and impulsiveness. I learned that sometimes the most profound victories are invisible to everyone except the person who patiently orchestrates them. Victories that restore order and dignity without inflicting harm. Victories that allow you to hold your head high, knowing that you have reclaimed not only what was lost, but also the integrity and humanity that betrayal might have otherwise taken from you. Life will always test us, and people will always disappoint us, but those who are willing to observe, wait, and act with intelligence and moral clarity discover a power that is far greater than wealth, far deeper than revenge, and far more enduring than the fleeting satisfaction of anger. In the quiet moments when I reflect on what happened, I feel a sense of peace that comes from knowing that justice need not be loud or brutal to be absolute, that patience and cleverness can restore balance, and that it is possible to rise above betrayal with both strength and compassion, reclaiming not just possessions or status, but the most important thing of all, your sense of self and your belief in your own worth.